Joining us for this interview of the IRF Summit Authors Corner is Steve Rasche, who is a senior fellow at the Religious Freedom Institute, as well as the member of the board of directors at Catholic University in Erbil, and a visiting scholar at the Kuka Center in Nigeria. Steve, thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure to be here, Jeremy.
Very excited to get to talk with you again about your book that came out in early 2020, The Disappearing People, The Tragic Fate of Christians in the Middle East. So very glad to talk with you about it. Take us into the story behind the story of how did the book even come into existence, and then we'll get into the story you tell, but how did you end up writing this book?
Sure. Well, I'd been a lawyer doing work, commercial work in Iraq, going back to the mid-2000s, 2006, 2007, and during that time I got to know many people in the Christian community just by the nature of the work we were doing. And in 2010, when the current Archbishop was made Archbishop of Erbil, I met him and went and introduced myself to him. We became friends. Over those next several years, I would help him on a pro bono basis with all the different problems they had then, and even in those years they had a huge problem of internally displaced people, IDPs, who had fled the violence in the south, in Baghdad and Basra and other places down south, and they had come to Erbil for the relative safety, but still he had many thousands of families there that didn't have livelihoods, that didn't have permanent homes, didn't really have a future, and he was trying to address those things. So I worked with him on feasibility studies for a university, for a hospital, for a whole range of other things, and we got to know each other then. And then when the ISIS war came in 2014, it came so quickly that international aid organizations weren't really prepared for it. The UN, the UNAMI mission was already preparing to leave Iraq.
Yep.
And so everybody was caught flat-footed, and there were 200,000 or more Iraqi Christians who had fled from Mosul and Nineveh, and most of them ended up in Erbil. Yep. And the Archbishop called and spoke to me and said, look, we have all of these people. This is a huge logistical humanitarian aid problem for us, for our small archdiocese, and we could really use some help. Would you be willing to come back and see what we can do? So, long story short, I came back in 2014, and subsequently over the next couple of months I wound up my private practice and entered into full-time work for the church as part of the lay staff for the church, and for the duration of the ISIS war. I managed the bulk of the international aid donors or donations, and the projects and the implementation of the projects, everything from the medical clinics, housing, food, education for the displaced people during the war, and then in the aftermath of the war, also directly involved in the resettlement of the displaced people back into their towns. So I was with the displaced during the war, and then with the church and the displaced as we attempted to go back into the towns. And the story, the book chronicles what happened during that time, the good and the bad, where we had successes and where we had some very real failures.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes this such a compelling book, is that it certainly gets to the policy questions, the big debates that were happening, the aid assistance, we'll talk about some of that, but it really is a very personal story. It's not just someone who was flying in and was there and did a few interviews over a few days and flew out, but this is, I think, as you say in the book, it's the scraps of voice memos and journal entries out in the Nineveh Plains with the sisters, with priests, with the community themselves, and it's telling the story from your vantage point, but in many ways it's telling the story of the people themselves. What are, as you think back to the book and the stories that come out, what are some of the most salient stories that helped people to understand what it was like as a community under threat in those years?
I think that, as you said, Jeremy, I tried as much as possible to just put the stories in their words. There are some of my personal reflections, but a lot of the stories are just from the notes and the video recordings that we took while we were there, and they're the stories of the people themselves. In terms of the things that really stood out for me, I think there were a couple of things. First is, we're here at the Religious Freedom Institute, or the International Religious Freedom Summit, and I think one thing that above everything else is seeing firsthand how important their faith was to them in their ability to survive this ordeal. And it's a thing I think we take for granted here in the West. We're not really threatened. We can go to church, at least until recently, but we go to church and nothing really terrible is going to happen. And they had all of that taken away from them, and it made them realize how important their faith was to them. And we really got to see that, what happens to a community when somebody tries to rip your faith and cultural heritage out by the roots and take it away from you. That really will stay with me, to really understand how important faith is when you have somebody trying to take it away. The other thing was just, the other things were just, the character of the people, the incredible patience and perseverance through all of these difficulties, and just the physical difficulty that the people had to live through. I mean, first, their towns had come in, they'd been violently wiped out, people were killed, they had to flee in the middle of the night, across the desert in the middle of the summer. And when they finally made it to safety, they were in really, really tough shape. Most of them had nothing left but just the clothes that they were wearing. And then they had to go and live for this, several year period during the displacement, and really difficult situations. I mean, they were, at first living in tents, and then they were put into these things euphemistically called caravans, which is like a construction trailer unit, but, no running water, barely any electricity, most cases never any air conditioning. And in Iraq itself, because of the war, water was really unreliable. Power was really unreliable. And where the people were is a situation where, it would be 125 in the summer, and it would snow in the winter. Yeah. And imagine, no running water, no heat, no air conditioning, and they would live in these tiny trailers, families of 6-8 people. Yep. They were there for years. Yep. And these are people, who had come, who were, by global standards, were mostly middle-class people, right, who had lived in comfortable homes, and then just had them wiped out completely. And to see the patience and the perseverance of these people to hold on, over all of that time. The third thing was, despite all of the difficulty, seeing, how much joy was still there in them. It was really struck me, I think it was impossible to get more than 3 Iraqis together without them laughing within the first 5 minutes. As bad as their situation was, they could find, some element of joy in it. So those are the things that, kind of generally really stuck with me. Yeah,
which are incredible, and those stories do come through in unthinkable circumstances of just the actions that were taken. You mentioned the importance of faith and how that was was uprooted so deeply. I mean, certainly in 2014 as ISIS comes in, but the conditions that led to that were also the result of policy choices and decisions that were made in the years before that. How did that come to be, and kind of how is that missed?
So we talk about that in the book, and the whole issue of the policy decisions going all the way back to 2003, and the pullout, then the having to go back in to deal with ISIS, have to come back into the country the second time. We spent some time dealing with that in the book. It's really a subject for its own book, and a pretty detailed one. But just to kind of look at it in a synopsis, we talk about how when the original decision was made to go in 2003, the Vatican said to the Bush administration, "Don't do this. You will start something that you won't be able to finish." How prophetic did that end up being? And then you get into the situation with the ISIS war, having come in and it so drastically changed the situation within the country. And then as the Obama administration was preparing to leave, the Christians were all saying, "You're leaving us to the wolves. This is not a good situation. This is not a stable country. And we don't have any faith that we're going to be protected." Well, again, prophetic. Unfortunately so in both cases. I think the final takeaway from that is it's pretty well accepted now that Iraq was just an absolute disaster from a policy standpoint, foreign policy standpoint for the U.S. We see that now coupled with the disaster that was Afghanistan. And one hopeful thing as an American, who supports our military and service members. I'm a member of an active duty military family, and we're very sensitive to those concerns. And we talk about that a little bit in the book. There's a very tragic and touching story about a U.S. Navy SEAL, Charlie Keating, the third, that was killed defending one of these Christian towns. And so, you have that part of it, but you also have the reality of these really disastrous foreign policy decisions that just caused untold horror and loss of life. We still don't have an accurate count on how many Iraqi civilians were killed. The low number is 250,000. The high number is as much as 1 million. We still don't know. And to put that into comparison, the Ukraine situation, awful as it is, but those numbers pale in comparison to what we saw in Iraq. And God forbid that anything happens in Ukraine to bring those levels up. But this is a part of our history that as Americans, we really need to come to grips with what were our leaders doing, what was our country doing that allowed us to get into these situations that have just been disastrous for everybody.
And those fracture points that led to that level touched Iraqis of every community, and the Christians and other religious minorities bore the brunt of that, distanced from political security actors, as you mentioned, left to the wolves in many ways as a result of that. And that's one side of the policy. Another piece that you mentioned, and you were saying during your time in Iraq in 2014 onward, so much of your work was not only coordinating the logistics in Iraq, but trying to secure the resources, working with certainly faith-based donors, communities that supported in massive ways, and governments as well, that in many cases wanted to help the victims of genocide. In that humanitarian response from someone who was in the midst of it. And another book to be written as well.
It is. It really is. You know, I came into it, this work, and with no axe to grind any way or one way or another. We were hoping that the UN would be a really positive partner in helping us, and there were some good people that we met in the UN that clearly wanted to do this. We were hoping that State Department, USAID, DFID, and some of these other government aid groups, we were hoping that they were going to be helpful. But, you know, over those almost 6 years there in Iraq, but particularly during the time of the war, it became starkly clear how fundamentally broken the international aid system is, the institutional international aid system is. Everything from their ability to react, their ability to have accurate reporting, so that they actually understood what was going on. We found that their own internal reporting was just completely wrong. I mean, frequently. They thought they were doing things in towns where there weren't any people. And they were publishing this in their public reports to the rest of the world, and we would look at these things and say, this is just so completely broken, and so that became a real thing, to the extent that towards the end we were pretty close to just giving up on getting any real help from any of these entities. Conversely, we saw how effective the private aid was, and how quickly that was able to actually get at the problems, actually help the people, decisions made that were separate from all the political considerations that big aid layers on top of all of their humanitarian aid. And I don't think that most people in the West who think, well, our governments are donating, funds to these things and we're contributing via the UN. I think that people don't understand at how completely sclerotic and burdened the aid process has become, the international aid process has become, and how very little of those aid dollars actually reach the needy people in an effective way. So much of it is simply siphoned off to address political concerns that really are not the concerns of those people in need. So we did see some glimpses and some paths towards positive change towards the end of the Trump administration. Some folks were sent over that really had their hearts in the right place. They sent over Max Primorak and some others who were starting to do some good work, but then there was a change in the administration. There's been a kind of an uncertain time now in terms of whether or not some of those things are going to stay in place. We've had some good interactions with state recently, I have to say, and we're hopeful that everybody learned some lessons, from that experience.
Yeah, and we'll come in a minute to a place where some of those lessons are being tested right now.
Yeah.
But your book ends 2019. The story for the people of Iraq isn't over. You have something coming out later this year that helps to continue to tell that story in a documentary version. Tell us a little bit about that and where people will be able to see that.
Well, you're absolutely right. Their story hasn't ended. It still continues. There's still real problems in terms of keeping the people, the small Christian community in Iraq, providing them with livelihoods and safe places to live in a way that they can live in dignity. And so we made a documentary film which shows some of this history that we talk about in this book, but also some of the current situation. And the documentary film is based around the visit of Pope Francis to Erbil, which you attended along with us, which we filmed. And so kind of using that visit of Pope Francis as a center point, we talk about that situation. And that film is scheduled to be released to the greater public later on, probably early fall.
Which is a really compelling story. That the Pope's visit was substantial, of kind of elevating once again, is there a future for these people, for the Christians of Iraq, the Yazidis, the Kakai, the others, and even the future for the majority communities? What's the story to come in Mosul and Baghdad and the south of Iraq? A story is still being written, but mentioned one of your affiliations is with something called the Kuka Center in Nigeria, and a lot of your work right now is with another people, once again, under threat in Nigeria. Tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing there, and how some of the same stories are repeating themselves once again.
So the Kuka Center was founded by Bishop Matthew Kuka of the Diocese of Sokoto, and who has become one of the senior spokespersons for the situation of the persecuted Christians in Nigeria. So he founded this center which focuses on ways of getting at peaceful resolution and making sure that the people can be helped in a positive way. And I had met Bishop Kuka when I was working in Iraq. Our paths had crossed several times, and then when the situation started getting more difficult there in Nigeria about 2 years ago, the Knights of Columbus, who were one of the primary funders of our work in Iraq, asked whether or not we thought we could take some of the best practices we had learned about how to put together aid mechanisms that actually worked and reached the people, and helping on messaging and things like that. And they asked if I'd be willing to go to Nigeria. I got in touch with Bishop Kuka and I said, okay, here's the situation. I could come, what do you think? And he was, open arms, welcomed me in. So the Knights of Columbus have been funding that work very generously, funding work at the Kuka Center for the church in Nigeria, trying to develop some coherent plans for their messaging to the rest of the world on what's happening there, and also trying to help in ways that we can alleviate some of the suffering for the people while they're working through all of this political and civil upheaval. So I've spent a lot of time in Nigeria now over the last year and a half, and anticipating spending a lot more time there as well. There are a lot of parallels to what we saw and learned in Iraq in terms of what works and what doesn't, and now applying those in Nigeria. So maybe there's another book in there at some point.
Well, we'll be looking forward for that. Steve, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this reminder of the policy challenges, the programmatic challenges, but at the center of it are people and real individuals and communities, and that's what your work has been about. The work we're doing in advancing religious freedom is about the right of each one of those people to live and flourish with their faith. So Steve, thanks so much for joining for this, and
thanks,
we'll work together.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.